Welcome to another one of our Tech for Campaigns Fireside Chats. My name is Kimai Cutler. I work in the tech industry as a partner at Initialized Capital, which is an early stage venture firm. But before that, I was a journalist for 10 years covering both the industry and finance out of Silicon Valley. And a couple of years ago, I got really involved in Bay Area housing policy. I wrote a pretty long piece that was like, I don't know, 13,000 words about why it was so difficult to create housing at all different income levels regionally in California. It kind of covered, you know, the history of zoning policy, the history of our property tax policy. And then from there, you know, a kind of movement began to find ways of building more housing at different tiers regionally in the Bay and then all across California. And so today I'm still involved in that. I serve on San Francisco's local coordinating homeless board, which allocates federal funding and the federal dollars spent on homelessness in the city of San Francisco. And I also serve on a number of boards of other nonprofits that are centered around land use and urban planning in the Bay Area. So a little bit about Tech for Campaigns. It is an organization that was started after the 2016 election. In February, since February, they've done about 50 campaign projects, 35 of which were in Virginia for this election this past November. And so they're kind of like a group that allocates tech talent and helps people with different expertise from industry work campaigns across the country. And if you're not part of the community, you want to get involved, you can go to techforcampaigns.org to sign up. We'd also like to thank you for providing us with this platform. It's a nonpartisan company that's facilitating these chats. So today, we're extremely lucky to have two very experienced, dedicated people from both the public sector and the private sector that have a lot of experience around on housing and real estate. So first, I'd love to have Dave Singleton introduce himself. He was one of the founders of Redfin. Dave, if you want to pop in.
Hi, sure. I'm Dave Selinger, and it's a pleasure to support some of the involvement, especially amongst the people that are hashtag resisting in terms of being involved in politics. I have been in the Silicon Valley for about 20 years. I grew up in Southern Oregon in a small, very red area in Southern Oregon called Merlin. It's a town of 300 people. Got to go to Stanford, do my research in artificial intelligence and robotics. Got to join Amazon, start the first AI team, and then started Redfin, started a company called Rich Relevance, and then now I'm the CEO of a company called Deed Sentinel. I'm here because I really believe that all of politics starts with being involved, and that's the single most important thing for me to see. And so anything that I can do to help people of all parts of the spectrum become involved, become informed is really valuable to me. And I'm really honored to get to speak with Julian and yourself today. Thanks.
Okay. And then it's my honor to introduce Julian Castro, who was the Secretary of the Housing and Urban Development Department under the Obama administration. He's had a very decorated career serving both at the local level and then at the national level. Julian, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks a lot, Kim, and thank you to everybody at Tech for Campaigns, and also to Dave. So yeah, I'm Julian Castro. I always feel like I have to spell that out because I have a twin brother, Joaquin, who is also in politics. He serves in Congress, but I'm a fellow Stanford alum, like Dave. And, I'm here because I first got interested in going into public service when I went away from home in San Antonio. I'd grown up in the public schools there and had an opportunity to go out to Stanford. And it was the first time that I'd really been away from home. And I got there in 1992, and I started comparing the Bay Area to the community that I'd grown up in, and just saw a community out there that was much more well-educated, had higher income levels, more entrepreneurial. And my interest in public service was, how could you create or build a city that was entrepreneurial, well-educated, had great income levels, ready for the future, and also maintained a sense of community and cohesion. And so eventually I ran for city council and then became mayor of San Antonio. served for 5 years, and then was appointed by President Obama to head HUD. And these days, I'm lecturing at the University of Texas LBJ School and finishing up a memoir, and just launched a PAC called Opportunity First. And my hope is that there are folks out there who have been inspired during these last 14 or 15 months since the November 16 election, who are ready to make a positive contribution with the skills and the talent that they have. And hopefully the conversation that we have today is helpful to you in doing that.
Okay. So I wanted to start with a more open-ended question. As someone who both serves on city and local commissions, but also works in the industry, I often find that engineers and CEOs and founders, and then people serving in government really misunderstand a lot about each other and how the private systems and public systems work. So I'm wondering if you could both share a little bit about what do you think the industry misunderstands about politics and government, and then what do you think the people that you've encountered in your public service misunderstand about Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. Yeah, I'll start off. Obviously, we have two different experiences, which will be good to hear both kind of sides of it. But my experience, having been principally in public service and government, I think that you have different industries. The tech industry is not unique. I think of the medical industry, for instance, where I believe that too many times folks that are some of our best educated and brightest minds and most energetic folks look at politics and they look at what's happening in DC, and they want to wash their hands of it. They think of politics and public service as just a dirty business. And I don't know how many times over the years, not just from people in tech, but mostly from just, everywhere you go, you hear, oh, all politicians are crooks, or they're all the same. They're only interested in themselves. They don't really want to do anything for the people they represent. And I will tell you that having served now, for a number of years, that the vast majority of people who are serving in public office want to do the right thing, and they're interested in benefiting their communities instead of themselves. However, we need the best and brightest in our nation and in our local communities working to hold those folks accountable and to help them with ideas on public policy that will ensure that they succeed. And so my message to folks is that you have one of the most important roles to play in helping to inform your elected officials and give them new ideas and new ways of looking at things. I think that's especially true when it comes to the tech industry, because y'all are light years ahead when it comes to ways to make things more efficient, to cut costs, to look at issues in a different light. So don't ever underestimate, number one, the fact that these folks will listen to you, and secondly, the value of your contribution that you can make to the whole process.
So Julian, thank you for opening up. And again, I apologize for pronouncing your name incorrectly there at the opening.
Oh, no, it's okay.
I did the same thing. I apologize too.
I apologize. My response will be broken down into two chunks. So first of all, I think my first experience in terms of being involved in the public sector and the misperceptions of technology are, I think it's directly reflective of what Julian said, is that the folks who are responsible for creating, enforcing, and ideating policy they're light years behind where we're at in the tech industry, but they want to understand. And there's really two approaches we can take, which is the kind of ignore or the engage. And one policy, for example, that comes up all the time is privacy. And we in the tech industry tend to say, well, EFF's taking care of that. Or someone else is kind of taking care of that. And that's one where I think we end up with these bipolar issues where we don't end up with solutions that serve us. And it's a very tiny contribution required to move that forward. So for example, on let's take an issue with EFF, with privacy. I spent maybe a total of 5 hours working with a couple of congressmen, head of policy, and the EFF, where there was a policy coming forward that was promoted by the GOP that basically kind of bashed all privacy and said that we can break through encryption and look at messaging, and we need to do that in order to protect people from pedophiles. Super good cause, super wonderful cause. And then the EFF said, if we do that, it's going to ruin all privacy. And those of us in tech know, hey, if you just take the time to really understand those two polar opposites, you can find a compromise that serves in the middle. And so I spent 3 to 4 hours working on that. And it turns out the answer, by the way, it is most likely from a technology perspective, parental controls. And at least it solves about 70% of the issue. And it doesn't violate privacy in the broader sense that EFF's concerned about. It doesn't strike us to these 144 character responses that everything's broken. But what it takes is someone with knowledge and empathy willing to kind of work both sides to come to the middle. And again, with about 5 hours of work, I was able to move both sides much, much closer to each other to a point where I think that that's at least being contemplated as the core policy, instead of one that breaks open all privacy and ruins all encryption, or one that has no protection for pedophiles, where the majority of pedophiles are coming forward and saying we're able to find children using Snapchat and Kik in a matter of hours, right? Like both of those are bad situations. And so we just got to work together to get to the middle. On the misperceptions of technology and on the public sector side, I would say, I actually would say that they're probably right. In my personal experience, the majority of my peers and my friends have washed their hands, and there are some of us that are willing to get involved and willing to spend our time. But my hope when I was at Stanford was that all these ideals that we grew up with would carry through with us, and that we would all get engaged in politics at some level or another. And for a lot of us, our heads got so big that we thought we're either going to influence the presidential outcome or we don't want to be involved. And I think that's also a fallacy, that we need to be involved. We need to be involved at our city level, at our neighborhood level, at our county level, at our state level, and at our federal level, if appropriate. But that involvement is the first step for those of us in tech. And we need to really kind of settle into the role that we should be playing in a broader society where we're impacting everything.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow that question up with more specific advice from Julian. For someone in the industry that's newly engaged, what is the best and most effective way, in your opinion, to get involved?
I'd say one straightforward and effective way to get involved is to approach a candidate that you like that's running your local, for city council or for state assembly, even for school board, and strike up a relationship with that person centered around the policy issues that you're concerned about, especially if these are first-time candidates, and we have a lot of first-time candidates running in 2018. They're always looking for folks to give them solid advice on policy issues. And that's one way that folks in tech can easily access these campaigns and get to know the process and get comfortable participating and being involved in the work of a candidate and then a public servant, and then go from there. I would advise folks to, if they have, obviously not everybody has the time to do that, but if you do have the time and you're inclined, I think folks would be surprised at, as Dave said, how open folks are to taking that advice.
Mm-hmm. One question that I have for you that intersects with your experience at HUD in the tech industry is this process that is ongoing now with Amazon pitching its second headquarters. And this, in theory, should be really, really exciting for cities because you bring 50,000 jobs, you bring economic growth, you bring the prospect of more tax revenue that then can be allocated towards better services and infrastructure. But there is this real apprehension based on the experience that we've seen in San Francisco and Seattle and a number of other tech hubs, that when you bring this type of job growth, it just gets priced in so quickly into the local real estate and housing market that people, for a subsegment of the population, a very big subsegment of the population, their wages don't move in tandem as fast as the rents and the real estate costs work. So I'm sort of wondering what can be done to address this, like at a federal level, and then what would you recommend that mayors do at a more local or regional level? Yeah,
it's a great question. And of course, all of us are watching what happens in the Amazon HQ2 selection process. I have very definite opinions about whether cities should engage in that kind of one-upsmanship. The short answer is I don't think they should. But,
Yep.
but apart from that, for the cities that are going for it, that are putting together these massive packages along with their state governments, this affordability crisis that we see out there is a wake-up call that you need to plan kaleidoscopically. It can't just be we're going to go chase these jobs and then we get the jobs and then some folks from our community are going to get those great jobs and a lot of people also are going to come from other places and get high-paying jobs, and all of a sudden we have the dynamic that you're talking about that gets even worse, where people that are trying to pay the rent can no longer do that, and people have to move out farther and farther away from the core of the city and the amenities. You need to plan for the whole thing. If you're chasing Amazon right now, that means that you need to be having a very serious conversation about planning for more affordable housing and getting help from the state and the federal government to do that. It can't just be one-sided. And I think Amazon's experience in Seattle is a very good example of that. The friction that's been created in San Francisco and the Bay Area around tech workers, which is not fair to those tech workers. They're pursuing their American dream, but the issue has to be addressed. And I've been glad to see some companies like Facebook and a few others step up and engage in the conversation of how they can be a part of affordable housing solutions. That's very nascent, right? That's still, I think, a drop in the bucket, but it's the right direction to go in. Everybody has a role to play there.
Well, and I would push that even a step further, right? We both went to Stanford and we saw the development of the separation between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. And that didn't, I think your point about it doesn't serve the tech workers well either is a really important one. There's really kind of these multiple versions of the collapse of that separation of haves and have-nots, but you start seeing it very, very quickly when you go to the places where there are entry-level jobs in downtown Palo Alto. And in the 90s and the early 2000s, those weren't comfortable places because you had people that were either feeling unsafe in their housing, feeling unsafe in their situation. And even though I was fortunate enough to be in the group of people who felt very comfortable and safe in my housing and in my career, to be in that situation, you had an increase in murder rates that was astronomical in the late 90s at the junctures between where those two communities met physically. And like you said, I think Facebook engaging in the dialogue of how do we take care of each other, I think I would say it's great, but it's still not enough. Like it has to manifest itself in a very meaningful way. And we have a role and responsibility in that, each individually within the tech community.
Yeah, I was in the Bay Area at an event for Habitat for Humanity, or two events a few months ago. And some folks out there were talking to me about principles that are being applied to try and reduce the cost of producing housing. And I think the tech industry that's found ways to make manufacturing processes cheaper and cheaper has a role to play in a basic issue like that, as well as land use issues and a private sector contribution to affordable housing development. The state of California, as you know, I think passed something like 15 different pieces of legislation this last legislative session to try and address this issue. So this is especially for those West Coast cities, which coincide with the tech cities in our country. This really is an all hands on deck issue because it's only getting worse and worse.
So the issue, though, is that the policy tools that cities have feel fairly limited, right? If you look, in 2002, I believe San Francisco enacted one of the very first inclusionary laws in this country. But if you look at the percentage that we can achieve at scale through that particular strategy, it's in the high teens, kind of maybe, in terms of the amount of protected housing you can build relative to market rate housing, because any higher than that, the project ceases to pencil and, has problems raising financing. But of course, creating, 80% whatever market rate housing and then 17%, affordable housing is kind of the opposite structure of the job creation that we're making. We're creating many more, minimum wage jobs, and we're creating these $100,000 jobs. And so, the tools that we have, both at the state and federal level have really declined since the last recession. And so cities kind of are at odds about what's like, is it inclusionary? What is it? And are there any tools there that you see that cities can use on top of that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first there's direct cash, right?
Yeah.
Direct funds, pumping more money in. There's also a real movement in land use restrictions, and what can we do to look at issues of, and I know this gets, especially in a city like San Francisco, there are many sides to this, yes, but issues of density, the effectiveness out there of rent control, because what we've seen is a sliding effectiveness of rent control over the last few years in the San Francisco Bay Area, many more folks getting kicked out. So how do you make adjustments to that policy? And then, and I know again that this is a subject of a lot of different controversy, but there's a YIMBY movement, a yes in my backyard movement, that has its detractors and its supporters. But I do think that in general around the country, we need more balance there, because too oftentimes when there's an affordable project that's proposed, all of the voices are just NIMBY, not in my backyard. And there's hardly anybody speaking up for the longer term need to invest in affordable housing and to get those affordable units on the ground. So that's a positive dynamic.
Mm-hmm. If I can, Julian, I loved that you brought up the YIMBY movement, because and I had an opportunity to interact with the Obama administration a little bit. My favorite thing about the Obama administration wasn't the policy side, kind of to the side, but even if you're kind of fiscally conservative, one of my favorite things about his administration was that he used the term "the power to convene" a lot, right? And I know you were a part of that as well. Is there something in your view outside of policy, right? For those of us that are socially progressive, but fiscally want to actually see the government be more responsible, not pouring money into solutions, but finding other ways to do it. Are there other things that you would put forward that you'd say, hey, this is another way to tackle this? I mean, I think where at least a lot of the tech community would say that's where I identify.
Yeah, no. And I think, this issue of how do you produce this stuff more cheaply and getting better and better at that. Also a conversation about land use restrictions, and how do you lower the cost of development? Smart conversations about regionalism and how you can make the most of the assets that you already have out there in the Bay Area, for instance. You all have BART, you have Caltrain. And sometimes when I say that out there, people snicker, as in, but they have questions about whether they're good systems. But compared to other regions in this country, that's a tremendous advantage to be able to build out along those lines and more densely and put more affordable units there. So being a part of those conversations, I think can make a big difference with policymakers in a way that is not necessarily how much more money are we going to spend on the issue.
Okay. Before we go to audience questions, Helena, I'd love for you to comment a little bit on a couple of policy changes that your successor administration has affected. Those being the mortgage interest deduction cap, the effect of corporate tax reform on low-income housing tax credits, and then third, the affirmatively furthering fair housing policy that you and the Obama administration championed under your term.
So I'll start with AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing, as folks may know, was a landmark rule that we put forward in 2015 that basically said to communities that get federal HUD money, you're going to have to get serious about making sure that you're investing in opportunity for everyone, and that we felt would help further desegregate communities in a positive way. Now the Trump administration has put that on hold. And the downside to this is that in California and other places, cities actually were coming up with excellent plans to both make investments, but also change policy so that they could better desegregate. And all of that, I think a lot of that is getting frozen. And the people who lose out on that will be low-income folks that are struggling, that aren't going to have the same opportunity to perhaps get into better schools and have more access to transit and access to good jobs. With regard to the low-income housing tax credit, it's very clear that this was a sloppily put together tax bill. And one of the casualties of that has been that light tech is not nearly as attractive, may not nearly be as attractive under this tax scheme as it was before. And that could affect up to 250,000, the production of up to 250,000 units of affordable housing. That's our best tool right now, federally, to create affordable units. So my hope is that Congress will come back when it cleans up some of the other issues that it has with that tax bill and address light tech, because I believe that we absolutely should invest in it, and we need to make sure that it's as effective as possible. And then you had one issue before that.
It was the mortgage interest deduction.
Yes.
So they capped it.
Very quick.
I know, yeah.
No, just I'd wish that they would follow something that Keith Ellison had proposed, which was to look at that interest deduction differently, but to use those resources then to go and invest, especially in affordable housing for extremely low income individuals, folks that are earning less than 30% of the area median income. That's not what happened. Again, I hope that that they'll do something like that in the future.
Okay, cool. So when Dave put out a feeler for questions from his audience, he got one about Latino representation in the technology industry. And he said that even though, this industry is based in areas with a huge Latino population, like all along coastal California, and that Latinos make up, 10 to 13% of graduates at elite institutions and 24% of the UC system, they are not represented at a commensurate level in the technology industry. And so this question from an audience member was like, at what point do we just give up on the tech industry claiming that diversity matters, and then have, a more policy or kind of procedural intervention to make sure that the industry is as representative as, other industries were kind of compelled to be in the past?
It's a great question. And as y'all know, this is an issue that the Latino community faces, not just in tech, but in other industries. A couple of years ago, of course, there was an upheaval over Hollywood and number of directors, actors, producers, and so forth. But with regard to tech, I was very fascinated by recent writings about tech companies seeing the value of a liberal arts education, and this idea that the best employees are not necessarily the ones that only have the technical skills. That fascinated me because usually when people say, well, we can't find Latinos or other candidates of color for these jobs, they say, well, they just don't have the technical background. And if you start looking at the numbers of folks with technical degrees, there are still, there's a decent sized pool, more than there used to be, but it's true, right? That by the numbers, the percentage is smaller. However, those aren't the only folks that are on the table for consideration. And so I don't believe for a second that if you earnestly tried, that you can't find well-qualified folks. Now, there's also a responsibility on the end of folks in the Latino community, which is, hey, people they're not gonna hire you out of thin air, right? You have to, of course, go and get that degree and do the hard work and put yourself up for contention. And I think one of the problems that we have right now is this loop that's created where they don't see themselves reflected in those organizations. And so there's perhaps a reticence about being as bold and going for it in the same way. And then folks who are hired, just like with law firms or engineering firms or other places, they feel a kind of culture shock, and they may not feel like that's the place for them. And so we lose them more quickly. So it's also incumbent upon these tech firms to go the extra mile and to make sure that they have mentors there, to make sure that these candidates that are being recruited are able to have their questions answered by people that they feel comfortable with. And then once they're there, that they be put on, that they be given the resources that they need to succeed. Part of the question, just the last thing I'll say is, should we give up on the tech industry, and you can't really do that because you can't legislate that people are, you can't tell people you're going to hire A, B, and C, right? But I do think that we can put more pressure on them and listen to their concerns, and they need to get more serious about making these kinds of hires and helping to ensure that they succeed.
Can I make this a little more personal, right? So that question came from a gentleman who's an executive at a tech company, and if you had let's just say his name's Alex, for example, not that it is, but let's just say, if you had Alex sitting right in front of you, what would you say? Alex, go do this, right? Is it establish that mentorship program? Is it meet with other executives and make sure that that's happening? Like, what would be your advice directly to him to move that needle?
And you're saying Alex is somebody in the industry? Let's
just say.
I would say the number one thing, and I come from the perspective of somebody that went up through one of the big law firms, but was only there for a brief time, to make sure that all of these folks are assigned mentors that can help guide them. Because in my experience, that's one of the most valuable things that you can have in an organization, is somebody showing you the ropes, somebody going to bat for you when they have those conversations about promotions and who's of value to the organization. A strong guide or shepherd there in the organization. That would be the first thing that I would do.
Great.
Do you have any thoughts on, so in California, half of our K through 12 population now is Latino. But when we look at how the industry hires in, the Bay Area, it's not necessarily through malice or malintent per se, but people tend to hire, the way that startups hire is they hire people that they know or that they've worked with before. And this process of going through your existing social network just reinforces, a set of social divides within the city. So I'm wondering, are there any ideas that you would have for better linkages between the existing, public educational systems and resources and the job side of the industry? Is it a workforce development? Is it what would something like that look like from a policy perspective?
Well, yeah, I think that in general it's efforts that just build coalitions and meld networks together, so that communities that don't often have access to the same networks are able to gain greater access because of the coalitions that are built. And, I think that can be done in local communities, in the private sector, and with the help of the public sector.
One other, I'm also curious, as we're kind of continuing on this diversity set of questions, the history and kind of the root of all of, a lot of these policies it comes from the mid 20th century and the civil rights movement and the effort to get more representation, in higher education, jobs, et cetera. But, over the last 20 years, the rhetoric has kind of shifted towards the value of diversity. And then that rhetoric in turn has been twisted into a rationalization of well, if you're going to have racial diversity, you also need to have, quote, diversity of thought. And so I'm wondering, how would one respond to that?
Well, I think you have diversity of thought. Obviously, when you have different people, they're not going to think exactly the same thing. But I take the point, but I also see that as something of a red herring. I've seen that as folks throwing up that argument to avoid a deeper conversation and sometimes avoid accountability about the fact that they don't have that many people of color or folks from historically underrepresented communities at the table. So I also think that argument undervalues the experience that growing up African American, for instance, in this nation gives you. And so I take the point, but I don't think that that's a reason to avoid the conversation about diversity.
If I were to take a step further, just because I know Julian has a political career, it's not a red herring; it's bullshit, right? I mean, it's annoying. It is it is taking a total to the side, right? Like Black Lives Matter and undermining what they stand for and saying Blue Lives Matter and White Lives Matter. It's yes, all those things matter, but one of them is getting attacked right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so yes, diversity of thought matters, but one of them is under siege, not intentionally, not out of malice, out of numbers, out of historical inertia. And and again, I know, Julian, you can't say that, but I don't have a political career, and so I'll say it.
No, I think that California especially has seen this history of folks who didn't want to face up to the fact that you had a very diverse state, but not the opportunity or the leadership there that reflected that. Whether that was Proposition, was it
13 or 209, yeah.
209 and the Ward Connolly push a few
Right.
years back, all of that stuff.
So we have another
Can I ask
audience.
a quick question though?
Sure, go for it.
So you mentioned social media, right? And so I've seen amongst people that are trying to do some of the coalition building and understanding on social media, and I'm not going to go to the extremes on some of the crazy stuff that's happening, but I've kind of seen groupings fall into one of two categories. One is I feel disrespected by the lack of empathy for my position, so therefore I'm not going to engage and I'm going to defriend and kind of isolate. And then the other side that's trying to reach out and establish some sort of understanding. But frankly, I think, Sean Parker's observation that like social media is creating more of a monster than an answer. And you mentioned social media in your last response. Do you see a way to avoid the monster, or do we have to wait for Facebook and Twitter to figure that out for us? What can we do again?
No, and I, as you can imagine, I and my brother and others in public, I'm not actively right now in public service, but that tweet and participate in social media grapple with this because, for instance, when somebody tweets at you something that's very negative and oftentimes disrespectful or name calling, what do? Do you summarily block the person, or do you try and engage in a conversation? And that's a hard one. For me, the decision-making process I go through is that if it seems like it's a fake account, I just block it, because there are a lot of those things out there, and you see that they've tweeted 150,000 times, and it's always about a certain subject matter, and there's no value there, or doesn't seem like. If it's an actual person, then I think that we are served in trying to engage people. That's also, though, tricky on a platform like Twitter or even Facebook, although I think Facebook is probably better, easier, because you can actually engage a little bit more in a back and forth in a reasonable way. So I believe the answer is that, the last thing that we can do is to just decide that we're going to have our say and that's it, that we're not going to engage in the back and forth. At the same time, these platforms do have to get a lot better about integrating tools that can facilitate that kind of civil discourse. And you know what? I'll admit right now, I'm not the tech guy here, but I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I believe that that's there for the taking, and I'm interested to see what kind of adjustments these platforms are going to make with all of the issues they've been dealing with after the 2016 election, and more broadly, I think this push that they see from consumers that, hey, how do we return to some sense of community and civility instead of going down this track that is going to both hurt the community and then hurt your company ultimately.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to immigration. As a child of multiple generations of immigrants, it's shocking given just the overwhelming amount of stuff that is happening. The kind of fact that dreamers are being used as a bargaining chip for some of the most potentially draconian immigration restrictions we've seen since the 1924 piece of legislation. And I'm wondering, what is the strategy out of that? How can people engage in the near term on this issue? And then longer term, how do we shift the dialogue towards a more inclusive vision of American society to combat this emergent nativism?
Yeah, well, my first piece of advice, if for the folks out there who are very moved by the compelling stories of our dreamers, and you feel like you want to do something, pick up the phone and call your congressman or congresswoman's office or your senator's office and make your opinion heard. Don't send them an email, call them, or go down to their office and politely make your voice heard, their district office. Because if there's anything that we've seen in the last year, it's that when people do push back with the phone calls, with the active engagement, with the marches, with getting to the ballot box in these special elections, that it makes a difference. And that should encourage everybody, because it means that our democracy can still work. And with the larger issue of, what are we going to do to make sure that the future of our dreamers and of undocumented immigrants that are not serious criminals, people that are working hard, and yes, they came in illegally, or they overstayed a visa, but they've been playing by the rules since then, and they're contributing to our nation. My hope is that if Democrats take back the House in 2018, that there's going to be some balance there, and perhaps there's a deal to be made. Before that, though, my hope is that there's a deal made before March 5th that is somewhere in between what has been proposed, because I know that it's not going to be completely in one direction or another. Trump's proposal is probably not going to be accepted, and the Democrats' proposal is not going to be accepted, and that March 5th deadline is coming up. So this is not a time when Congress can take its usual breaks. We're going to work Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then just go home. They need to keep working at it until they get something done, because these dreamers are living in tremendous uncertainty with a lot of anxiety.
Mm-hmm. What do you do?
One thing there specifically that Julian mentioned, and this is specifically for the tech community, where we tend to kind of like to sit behind our laptop or our phone and influence politics that way, is it's okay. Most of the politicians with whom I've interacted don't know how to receive and count and deal with tweets and emails like that. It is important to do that if that's all you can do. But if you can get up, just scoot over to your local representative's office and just show up, walk in and say, I'm just here to show my support for X or Y or Z. That makes a much larger difference, and they know how to count those. There are so many trolls and bots especially on Twitter and on social media, that most of the offices that I have interacted with kind of categorically ignore the numbers of support one way or the other, with the exception of Dr. Trump, who seems to like to count those things in exaggerated numbers. But so please, if you can't do, as ridiculous as it seems, do the traditional things, because those things are counted and they do make a difference.
Mm-hmm. What do you recommend you do if you live in a South? Like, I mean, I know that Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi, they are going to be aligned with, my views on immigration. What do you do with representatives, that are already going to go to bat for this issue? Does calling them and emailing or showing up in person still matter? Or is it getting people in more kind of hesitant or flippable areas to call their legislators?
Yeah, of course it still matters. You want to make sure that that they're as full-throated advocates as they can be. But you're right. You also can have a role to play in encouraging people who live in other communities that are swing districts, especially where some of the representatives that could go either way, they can be influenced by their constituents. And so, it's so easy now to do phone bank in different congressional districts, encouraging constituents somewhere else, if they're like-minded, to take an action. And that might be a way that you can help.
And I would push, though, even if you do, to still do it, right? I mean, XKCD, for those of us that read it, they produced, I thought, the best visual graphic showing our democracy, and that it really is a plurality. And that even when we have these districts that are red, that they're read by 6, 8, 10%. They're not read by 90% in the way that CNN and Fox News kind of present these red and blue states, and there are just a few that are purple. And so I would really encourage you, even if you live in a district where it swings the other direction heavily, that you do that. I mean, these people are concerned about getting reelected. They're concerned about raising enough funds. And the more that you can push them in that direction, I think that they'll ultimately listen to money and funds and reelection.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an optimist, though. So,
so another audience question. One questioner wanted to know, what does a pro-business, pro-growth agenda look like that actually is inclusive and supports the welfare of the broader American population? I mean, particularly for those that don't benefit from, like, quote unquote, corporate economic growth. And I mean, both of you can jump in on this. I mean, this is an evolving discussion.
Well, I think that oftentimes, especially the longer term interests of our American business community are fully consistent with making the kinds of investments that that folks on the left have been talking about. I've said for many years, for instance, that I believe that brain power is the new currency of success in the 21st century global economy, and that the nations that create it are going to be the ones that thrive, and those that don't are going to fall behind. It was Republic Day the other day in India, and I remember being there 5 years ago in Chennai, and one of the government officials telling me that in the state of Tamil Nadu alone, there were 400 different engineering programs. And the United States is competing in an unprecedented way with countries around the world that are producing tons and tons of young people that are tremendously talented and very intelligent, and that are creating companies that are going to compete massively with our American businesses. That means that we need universal pre-K. It means that we need to make college affordable for people. It means we need to ensure that everybody has skills that are employable. That's the way that you're going to make American business competitive, in addition to, of course, looking at things like the tax structure and so forth. But the longer term, I've always believed that the longer term interests of the business community and the American community as a whole are consistent.
Mm-hmm.
I would echo that. The even taking a somewhat nationalist view of kind of us versus them on this global scale of competition, that it's not at odds in any way with investing in education. I've spent a lot of the last year on the phone with entrepreneurs in China and Hong Kong, and I think we in Silicon Valley have kind of thought, oh yeah, those are great places to get engineers, but they're not going to get that upper level of thought. And you can't find in history a more rapid creation of billionaires than we have seen in China in the last 10 years. You can't find in history a more rapid pace of innovation than we have seen in China in the last 5 years. You cannot find a feature on Facebook that was not invented at WeChat in the last 5 years. And I think that we have this sense of hubris, especially, frankly, I think among the tech community, that will be somewhat insulated from this. But I think that the last 5 years especially have really shown that's not the case. And then you add to it the voluminous production of incredible tech talent. I'm focused in AI, and one of my heroes in AI space is a guy named Tim Detmers, and he predicts that by 2030, 90% of artificial intelligence research will be coming out of China. And so if you believe that human thought is the currency of the future and AI is the realization of that currency, we're in quite a bind where we need to really come together as a nation in order to compete at that grand scale. And I think that's a very legitimate thing. From an investment perspective, I'd love to ask you, Julian, if I could. I think in general, a lot of us see the definition of investment and as fiscal investments, and I think a lot of the tech community identify themselves as fiscally conservative but socially progressive. Where do we bridge that gap for a lot of the tech community, or do we just really need to suck it up and say, look, it's got to be fiscal investment too, and it's got to be policy. As much as we may dislike creating a bigger government, that's the answer, and that's the only path forward.
Well, I think that's an important part of the answer. With the caveat that, of course, we always need to make sure that organizations are as effective and efficient and have as much integrity as possible, right? And we can always read stories about a school district that, had this or that going on or wasn't spending the money the way that it was supposed to. But by and large, there is a gap, and a growing gap, in our commitment to educating young people in the country. And certainly the cost of higher education is something that is becoming less and less affordable for young people. I mean, the cost has skyrocketed. So we need to address that with funds, with investment, I think, immediately. But it's not just that. It's also leadership, for instance. You go out to school districts, and a lot of school boards don't nearly have the level of leadership that you need to implement sound, forward-looking educational policy, and do it in a way that has a larger vision to it. And so there's a dearth of leadership there, frankly. What role does the business community and the tech community have to play in enhancing that leadership? You have in different local communities businesses that have stepped up on that, but there's still a gap there. So all around, we need to focus our investments, not just with resources, but with leadership and other things to improve our outcomes on education.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask, I often hear in the industry, well, we just need to educate people and we need to give them more skills. And then if they do that, they'll be able to flexibly move around the job market. But the reality for a lot of minimum wage and low income workers in California, I mean, we do have systems. We have the University of California and CSU and community college system in the state. With the community college system, the main issue there is completion, right? And so if people don't have the economic security, when they're working this many jobs and trying to take community college classes on the side, they just drop out. And so if you don't support that wage end of their livelihoods, then they're not actually going to be able to stay and complete the educational and skills training that our systems are offering. So how would you support that side of this skills question?
Well, number one, I believe that at least 2 years of a college or university should be free in the United States. And yeah. I know that some people push back on that and say, well, I went to school and I went through the first 12 grades and then I had to work my way through college or university. And I would just say, and Dave has rightly, I think, pointed out in a different context, though, that because I don't know whether he agrees with this or not, but the world has changed. Mm-hmm. We're not in the year 1918 or even 1958 or even 1988. We're in 2018, and our competition around the world has changed fundamentally. Their education levels have changed. They've gotten sharper. What it takes to succeed in the future is a much more educated population. So we can't afford to do the same old thing that we've been doing. And I think part of the change that we need to make is to allow folks to go higher and at least get those 2 more years in and get a certificate or get a associate's degree that will give them the skills that they need to be employable in the 21st century global economy. That's one thing.
What are the smartest? Sorry, go ahead.
A little different, which is spot on. But I'd take it even to an extreme that in my analysis of what it takes to get education is not very far from, I think, a very simple model, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you have shelter and safety at the bottom. And to your observation, Kim, if you don't have those, you don't pursue the top of the pyramid. And I think that we tend to have these incredibly intellectualized conversations about what it takes to get somewhere without just really understanding that at the core of the unit that we're talking about is a human being, and that the unit of the human being requires all of these levels to be provided. And it doesn't mean provided handout, right? But they need to have access to meet all of those needs in order to achieve the higher objectives, and that we as a country need to be able to compete at the higher objectives. And so my personal answer to that is I think wage is important. I don't really care how we get there from a policy perspective, but that we have to start thinking about, and I think both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have really lost this sense of the individual being at the center. And frankly, Trump, for all of his fill in the blank, has done a really amazing job of appealing to that sense of individualism in that set of needs. And so in my view, I think that both the parties need to start engaging at the level of the individual in a much more meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Julian, I want to ask, what are the smartest policy plans or ideas you've seen around making college and these types of educational skills training and all of that, what are the smartest policy ideas you've seen around making that affordable? Because traditionally the way the U.S. has done it is through expanding access to credit and to loans. And in both the housing and educational sectors, I mean, a lot of that access to debt financing just simply gets kind of priced back into the cost of tuition or the housing itself.
Yeah, there are a number of different policy approaches that have been used in terms of trying to reduce the cost of a university or community college. There are certain states that have experimented with, and I think New York now is one of them, free community college. There are cities that have put programs in place where you're able to get a whole bunch of college credit before you actually go to college. And so you can lower the overall cost because you're already done basically with, up to a year and a half of what you need for an associate's degree. So there are a number of ways that we can tackle this, but I just think that ultimately that we're going to need to make a larger investment to get folks more well-educated than they are now. And you brought up college completion. You're right. That's sort of the unspoken, I wouldn't say secret, but negative mark on universities and colleges is that they get a lot of people in, and we were focused for a long time on going to college, but they have an atrocious completion rate. Mm-hmm. And so folks need to be supported. I think Dave made good points about how do you ensure that people are able to meet their basic needs so that then they can focus on finishing their education. Policymakers need to be more attuned to that part of the question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so since we're coming to the end of our time, I want to kind of end kind of where we started, which is to ask you both, what are one or two things that the technology industry can do starting today to better support American public institutions and American democracy?
I'd say number one, adopt a politician and figure out how you can make a positive difference in how they make policy. Whether it's city council, school board, state assembly, volunteer your ideas and your thoughts to somebody who is in the policy-making arena. And secondly, be a part of these conversations in your community. For instance, we talked about people who are pushing back and saying, no, we need to build more affordable housing in the Bay Area. Because you know what? I can tell you as a policymaker, oftentimes we don't hear those voices because folks stay home. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing that I do know about other industries is that they tremendously respect the entrepreneurialism and the innovation and the intelligence behind the tech industry. And so your voice does matter. So enter the debate at the community level.
Mm-hmm.
I would personally echo that directly. I think that would be my first and foremost recommendation. The second one I would say is there are politicians out there that are making use of the skill sets that we're building up in the tech community. Two that I would put my personal dig into a little bit that I'd push you to consider would be Eric Swalwell, who's California 15, and Brian Ford, whom Eric just sponsored this morning, who's down in LA, and he's in a swing area. And Brian was the technology advisor to President Obama and is now running for his Congress in a red district in Orange County. So I think there are opportunities for us to not only get engaged in the policy level, there are opportunities for us to get engaged in the campaign level. I know that's what Tech for Campaign is doing. I also have to stick in one last thing because I got a late breaking social media question for Julian.
Okay, great.
Which is, And I gotta do this one justice. So I'm gonna read it real carefully. From my friend Alejandra Sejanj, and she says, "Will you run for president? Please."
Tell her thank you for the question. She's my favorite questioner of the day. No, I don't know. I might.
All right. And with that, thank you so much for your participation, both of you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to Tech for Campaigns for hosting this discussion.